Our guest today is Marc Jeuland. Marc is an assistant professor at the Sanford School at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. He's an environmental engineer and water resources systems analyst. He teaches in the area of environment and development and does research in these areas, including the area of global public health. He's done some really interesting research recently on household water demand in India and Cambodia, and he's going to talk to us about that today. So, Marc, I'm just delighted you're here. Thanks so much for coming over.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start, and let me ask you about your research questions. I mean, what were your research questions in Cambodia and India? What were you trying to do?
Sure, and I think as I answer this question, it's probably best to give a little bit of history about these two sites. The first one, which is in India, in Andhra Pradesh, this is southeastern India, was actually a study that I got involved with at a later stage. And it was a follow-on on a community-level trial of these water treatment plants and their advanced water treatment plants. The idea of these plants was that if you installed highly advanced treatment at the community level and made that available to households for a fee, that they would perhaps purchase better quality water and consume better quality water. What they found in that study was that use rates were quite low from these treatment plants. And so we asked the question of whether maybe people weren't buying this water because they didn't realize how contaminated their drinking water was.
This was the RTI study that Christy Polis was involved in.
That's
right?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So as I remember, the water was pretty expensive.
It was not that expensive, actually. If you, I guess, relative to a free option that you have in these communities, which is, hand pump.
But they had to pay when they went to the...
They would pay about 2.5 to 5 cents, depending on the community, per 20-liter jerry can. So that's, really not that expensive. And if we think about point-of-use treatment alternatives, they would be comparable.
Right.
So the water wasn't that expensive, but there were other questions about convenience of these supplies, if households had to walk long distances to get to these kiosks. And also, just general inertia in households wanting to do what they've routinely done. So the idea then was to do some simple water quality testing and information provision to households to see if a signal of contamination would motivate them to go and purchase.
So in the previous study,
water.
they didn't know really whether the water was contaminated or not. So you're going to give them the information to tell them.
That's right.
Yeah.
The second study is a little bit different. Actually, at the inception phase of that study, I helped to think about the design with a colleague, Joe Brown, who's now at the Georgia Institute of Technology. We were interested in the question of whether providing chlorinated treatment of irregular and kind of low dependability supplies of drinking water would help provide some health impacts to communities. And these were in communities where water supplies were actually fairly convenient for households. So they had alternatives like rainwater harvesting and also piped water networks. But the piped water networks didn't work all the time. They were intermittent, and they were not typically treated in a dependable way by system operators. So these were private systems, by and large. At the design phase, we thought we would try a cluster randomized trial approach in communities where some of them would get some kind of inline or unintrusive chlorination technology that could be put at the network level or even screwed onto taps to auto-chlorinate their water. But our funder for the study kind of backed out after our initial baseline study, didn't want to fund the full cluster randomized trial. So we decided we still had this rich set of baseline data on these communities, and we knew something about demand for water treatment following our baseline study. We decided to do a similar information experiment, but combine it with sale of point-of-use technologies, and in this case, Aquatabs, which is a tablet of chlorine a disinfectant product that households could use to treat their water. So it was a similar idea in the end, but a very different history in terms of how the study was developed.
So what were your research questions then in the two places? You have both the interventions of the chlorine, and you also have the information treatment.
Right.
What were you thinking your hypotheses would be?
So in the first one, it was a really simple question. It was this idea that we wanted to know if households would respond to a contaminated water signal and purchase more water from these treatment plants that they weren't using. So it was in part a question about whether people really know how contaminated their water is. And we didn't do extensive work trying to understand what their perceptions of drinking water quality were, but we used this randomized information experiment to see if there would be a response among those who got information and those who did not. In the other study, the question was more about stimulation of demand for point-of-use treatment. And there are lots of questions about point-of-use treatment and whether it's a good idea, whether it's something that households see the value of. So we wanted to test that idea more specifically. And we did some more careful measurements of perceptions of drinking water quality. So we wanted to isolate the mechanisms through which demand might be affected and see if, it was simply salespeople armed with water quality tests that gives people some nervousness about their water supply, or whether they actually understood the contamination signal that they got from the information. And so we tested that.
So what did you find? Maybe we'll start with India.
Right. So in India, we found that use of packaged drinking water from these treatment plants increased by 50%. So that looks like a big effect, right? But it was actually a very modest effect because it was working off of a low baseline of use. So about 5 to 10% of households were purchasing water, so a 50% effect is another 5% on top of that. And so we see that some people do respond to the information, but that the vast majority don't change anything, really. And there are multiple reasons why that
What do you
might
think?
be.
Like what? It's kind of discouraging, right? I mean,
among them could be the possibility that this water is expensive, and they just decide that they're cash constrained. They don't have the possibility. Another possibility is that they really know that this treated water is maybe not all it's cracked up to be. In fact, they have to bring it home and store it. And during the storage process, that water can be contaminated. So this is the typical argument in favor of point-of-use treatment is that if you do community-level interventions, people don't end up better off because the water gets contaminated later anyway. We did also try to track other behaviors because the information was accompanied by a script that said you can go and buy this water from drinking plants, the treated drinking water plants, or you can do other things. You can treat your water in-house, you can clean your containers more often, you can avoid storing water for long periods of time in your house, you can use safe methods of taking water out of your containers. And we did see some modest responses along each of those margins as well. But again, there was no kind of signal really large effect on any of those behaviors. They were all pretty modest effects. And this points, I think, to the complexity of water and sanitation interventions and the fact that there's a whole set of things that households can do. And so, just targeting a single thing is often not going to get you the whole way towards safe water.
I've got some more questions about India, but why don't we just get the overview of Cambodia and what you found in Cambodia?
Okay, so I mentioned in Cambodia that we did some careful baseline surveys ahead of doing this information experiment, and we learned some things in those baseline surveys. I'd highlight three things in particular. So the first thing that we learned was that water quality is really bad at the household level. We tested for E. coli, found high contamination rates, and it didn't really matter what the source was. So we tested water from piped water supplies, rainwater storage, and as well as public taps. And we found contamination in all of them by the time the household was consuming this water. And in fact, quality got worse in the house. So we did see this degradation in water quality. Second thing we saw, because we did some contingent valuation surveys at the time and questions, was that perceptions are not unrelated to demand for water quality. That's not surprising. Obviously, it's very hard to say something causal about that link because the things that drive demand are also maybe driving these perceptions. So that, in large part, motivated our experiment, which was randomized information provision, which would kind of shock perceptions and give us a clear signal through perceptions and demand. But we found, by and large, that people who thought their water was safer actually had higher demand for water treatment, further water treatment, which is consistent with the story that these are risk-averse people who are really worried about their water and they just want to do everything they can to make it better. And then there's a whole other set of people who sort of don't really think their water is very safe, but they also have very low demand. They're also maybe poorer people, and they are perhaps more constrained in their choices. So those two things were some of the key findings from our baseline work. From the information experiment, we then learned that people do respond to information in the way we would expect. So a contaminated signal does change perceptions in the way that we would expect. And I'm happy to talk about how we measured perceptions if that's of interest later. But that also translates into higher demand. So a negative movement in perceptions does increase demand, and we see this pretty consistently with the overall treatment effect. But the second main finding here is that there's heterogeneity in that impact. And I told you about these two types of people. Well, it turned out that the two communities we worked in were basically different along these socioeconomic and risk profile lines, and that the community with initially sort of lower perceptions of drinking water quality was actually the one that responded to information. So these were the people who didn't really care initially and had lower demand to start with. They were the ones who responded to information. The people who had higher demand initially, their perceptions didn't really change. So they were already thinking
and just to
their water was
emphasize,
safe.
the information here was actually information about the quality of their individual water.
That's correct.
And how did you measure that? At the household level?
Right. So the information was provided through a household water test, and this was randomized to half of the households, stratified by these two communities. And it was a simple presence-absence test, which is not very specific for E. coli or specific contaminants in water, but indicates the presence of coliforms. So it's called an H2s test. The reason we chose it was because it provides salient information. It's easy to understand. Your test tube turns black if it's contaminated, and it stays clear.
Did they see it? Is it in their house?
And they saw it. We left the sample with them overnight, so they observed the change. And so it's suited our purposes for that reason. You didn't have to take it back to a lab and incubate it and come back and tell them your water's contaminated. They might not believe that. So this was simple in that sense.
Yeah. So you said in the case of Uttar Pradesh that the magnitude of the effect was small. What about the magnitude of the information treatment effect in Cambodia?
So similarly, it was somewhat of a modest effect. But it's hard to compare the size of the effects because we were selling a very different product. And in the case of Cambodia, every household, whether they got the information or not, got a sales pitch to buy these Aquatabs products. And we found that about 50% of the sample purchased some Aquatabs. The quantity varied quite a bit. And then with the information, in one community, the effect was about 10 percentage points. So a 20% effect.
Right.
But in the other community, no impact. So again, the effect sort of in percentage points is roughly the same. It's about 5 percentage points, and the baseline is different.
So in both cases, you've got a lot of people receiving information and not responding
Right.
to it.
But in Cambodia, interestingly enough, half of the sample did buy the product even without the information. So that tells us something about demand for point-of-use treatment, at least short-term demand.
What do you know about the duration of the treatment effect in these places? I mean, how long do you think this bump up in use is going to last?
Right. So this is a really good question, and we don't know a lot because we did these follow-up surveys relatively quick succession after the intervention. In Andhra Pradesh, the follow-up survey was 1 month after information was provided, and in Cambodia it was about 6 weeks. What we didn't do in India was then a subsequent sales of something because they were responding to what their community had available or the behaviors that were available. We weren't combining it with a marketing approach. But in Cambodia, we did try to sell products again at the 6-week follow-up to see if demand persisted. But it's hard to interpret those signals because a lot of households still had some aquatabs, so they may not have seen the need to buy more. We didn't see a lasting effect.
Why did they still have aquatabs? Why weren't they used up?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the interesting subsequent findings, if you dig into the data from the Cambodia study, we had asked people to keep their packaging. Now, that's kind of complicated because lots of households don't really care and they would throw away their packaging. But we found that those who responded to the information, so remember those who got the test result, and most of them were contaminated test results, they responded in this one community by purchasing more aquatabs. But that impact was concentrated on people who actually did not use much of the aquatabs. Okay, so that tells us that maybe this information really doesn't accomplish that much because households, in fact, those that you get with the information, they're also the least likely to use the products over time.
Do you have any information on health outcomes, actually? I mean,
Right.
that would tell you a little bit about whether they're using the aquatabs regularly, if it was reliable.
So this is in terms of broader implications of these studies, and in both of them we don't see a real health signal. We rely on self-reported diarrheal disease, which is notoriously hard to measure, and the studies were not powered to see impacts on diarrheal disease. But even so, we don't see a health signal. It's hard to say what the net effect of all of this really is. And in fact, if what we see in other studies that I've been involved with is that people sometimes compensate, and if they do one thing, they do less of another protective behavior.
Actually, I wanted to ask you about that in terms of a positive test. A positive test meaning your water is not contaminated. So do people stop doing good things when they find out from you that their water isn't contaminated after all?
Right. So statistically, this is a hard question to answer with our sample because we had 900 households in Cambodia, and about 90% of those tested for contaminated water. So we have a very small group of households, about 100, who didn't have contamination. But we do see for them that their perceptions of water quality actually improved, so they thought their water was safer, the signal you would expect, and that seems to translate into lower demand for aquatabs. Okay, so on one level, maybe we shouldn't be worried, their water was safe, so they shouldn't be wasting their money on aquatabs. But on another level, if they start doing other things that are compensating behaviors, taking other risks, then it's
just one sample too, right? I mean, they have one data point on the quality of their water, so it's hard to judge, Yeah. So what would you say about the sort of broader implications of your work? What does it mean outside of Cambodia and Andhra Pradesh in terms of what you're thinking about sort of information treatments as a policy intervention and also point-of-use treatment as a policy intervention?
I think I can pretty safely say that based on the literature, not just my own studies, but other findings in the literature, that information provision can be an effective strategy for promoting these health interventions and adoption of environmental health improvements. But the effect is modest. So, I mean, obviously, it has to be combined with other strategies if we really believe that a particular strategy is effective. In terms of generalizability of these specific findings, I would say that we have to be pretty cautious about the results in these sites. And there are a couple of reasons for that. So one is, in Cambodia itself, we see heterogeneity within communities in terms of who responds and who doesn't. And that's related to all kinds of preferences and some of these socioeconomic factors that drive demand. But also across the sites, we see different responses. And we see that across the two communities in Cambodia, that we see completely different. One place doesn't respond to information, the other does. In India, we see some responses, but again, the shift in behaviors isn't always concentrated on buying treated drinking water. Sometimes it's doing other behaviors. So it's hard to say exactly what the effect of information will be in any given community. And, we've thought about this in the context of how we think about costs and benefits of water and sanitation interventions using simulation approaches. The parameters that we measure in these specific studies, measuring these impacts, are a single parameter that determines these costs and benefits, and there's a whole other set of things. These households have other priorities. They also have other priorities with respect to drinking water, so convenience may be more important than quality, or sometimes the aesthetics, the taste of the drinking water may be important. Another thing that we tested in Cambodia was whether households are sensitive to the taste of chlorine. We did this with double-blinded taste tests. So neither the enumerator nor the household knew which of their samples had chlorine in it, and we asked them to identify their preferred samples.
What'd you find?
And we do see that people don't like the chlorinated samples once they reach a level that's the recommended treatment level for chlorine. So if the concentration is lower than that recommended level, they don't really detect it. But if we start getting to the recommended treatment concentration, people don't like the water. So we could assume that they would then probably respond in a point of use setting by not using the product as much.
Do you think that would happen in a pipe system that was chlorinated?
So that's a different question. And if they had alternatives, they might switch away. And this was actually one of the original hypotheses that we wanted to test with these inline or non-intrusive chlorination devices, was whether we'd see people switching to rainwater, because in Cambodia they have lots of rainwater harvesting. But in systems where there's no choice and you get all of your water through the piped water supply, and that's the most convenient thing, then maybe the chlorine distaste is not such a big issue, and that's sort of the case in the U.S. and in developed countries where we just drink the tap water because that's what's there.
Right. So, so how would you respond to somebody that says they read your papers and they say they learn the effect is modest from the information treatment, and people have this big gap between the reality of the water quality and what their perceptions of the water quality are, and somebody says, we should just get on with this and get these people piped water. It's chlorinated and good for their health. And this point-of-use treatment, information treatments, this is all kind of a dead end.
I think it's an important question to ask. But the truth is that piped water systems are a long way off in a lot of these communities, at least dependable piped water systems that give people high-quality water. So I think in the meantime, there are still some things that need to be worked on. And one of those things is kind of bridging this disconnect between perceptions of water quality and actual water quality. Water quality is really hard to observe. We find that households in Cambodia, their perceptions are actually completely uncorrelated with the tests. I mentioned these E. coli tests at baseline. We actually find a negative correlation between safety perceptions and the actual E. coli contamination levels. So people don't know. They don't observe this contamination. And so on some level, that's a problem because households should know. Here in the U.S., we know that our water is safe. We get these drinking water report cards, and we take it for granted that this water is basically drinkable. People in developing countries, they just don't have that information. They don't know. So they can't make these informed choices. So at some level, information is useful for at least informing people, but you can't do it in a one-shot sort of case like we do in these tests. I think you'd have to provide information over time and test water, and that may get expensive.
Do you have any sense of the cost of information treatment relative to other interventions, or sort of the cost effectiveness of a information strategy like you've used in these research projects?
So I think if you were to use these H2s tests, which are the tests we use in these papers, which are salient and give a presence-absence signal, it's pretty cheap. It's about $1 a test. And it can be manufactured cheaper. We actually worked in Cambodia with a local lab to actually manufacture these products. And at scale, they could manufacture it, I'm sure, for fractions of $1 a test. That is not very expensive, and it may pay for itself if you're the packaged treatment water provider. They're selling this water at about 5 cents per jerry can. So if you got people buying for a month, you could provide them a monthly test, and it would pay for itself.
Yeah.
But whether it's a good business strategy, they'd have to work out whether that demand bump was worth it.
If you were thinking about using an information treatment, not for research, but for a public health strategy, an intervention to help people, forget about your research papers, what would you recommend? How would you do this for a?
Yeah, I think the public health case is a bit more complicated than perhaps the business case trying to sell one of these products or sell packaged treated drinking water. And the reason is because that H2s test is not a reliable indicator of health impact. So if you wanted to really tell people that their water was unsafe, you'd need to do more sophisticated microbial tests, and those start to become expensive. So people have been trying to work on some cheaper ways of testing for E. coli or other pathogens of concern in a variety of different labs and universities around the world. But those tests are still considerably more expensive than this simple H2s test. And at that point, you have to ask whether it's cost effective, particularly given the fact that we don't see a clear impact on health from providing this information.
Do you think it would ever make sense for the businesses themselves that are selling the chlorine tablets to provide the test to households to try to bump up demand?
Yeah, this was one of the things that we thought would maybe appeal to our partner who was thinking about these chlorinated products. And they are aware of the fact that households don't tend to know much about contamination. And they were pretty interested by the results, seeing that there would be this impact on demand. I think they certainly would consider doing something like this. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. It's been a great. Is there anything else you'd like to say about your findings, or anything that the students would want to know?
No, I think this has been great, and thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. We're going to post the references for Mark's papers on both the Cambodia and the India work at the end of the interview, and so you'll be able to get access to the papers.
Thank you.
Thanks again.